The office was thick with the smell of stale coffee and floor wax. Thomas Reed did not wait for an invitation to sit. He reached into his bag, pulled out a thick manila folder, and dropped it onto the polished wood of the superintendent's desk. The sound of the paper hitting the surface was sharp, echoing through the room like a gavel strike. It sat there, thick and unyielding, a physical weight in the center of the clean, empty space. Thomas leaned forward, his hands flat on the desk, his knuckles white. The superintendent did not look up from his computer screen at first. When he finally shifted his gaze, he glanced at the folder with a dismissive flick of his eyes, then pushed it toward the edge of the mahogany desk without ever breaking the seal. He stared at Thomas, his expression hardening into a mask of practiced indifference. Thomas felt the shift in the room. The air grew stagnant. He had spent 3 decades in the field, and he knew exactly what that look meant. The conversation was already over before it had even begun. But Thomas did not move. He kept his eyes locked on the superintendent, waiting for the silence to break, his resolve anchored by the evidence sitting just inches away. Thomas did not blink. He ignored the shove and reached out, pulling the folder back into the center of the desk with a slow, deliberate motion. He tapped the cardboard cover twice, the sound rhythmic and insistent. "I am retiring next week," Thomas said, his voice level and steady, carrying the weight of 30 years of mountain air and hard winters. "I have walked every ridge and mapped every stream in this park. I have given this department more than my life, but I am not leaving until you see what is in this file." He leaned closer, his shadow falling across the superintendent's paperwork. "This is not a request for a meeting. This is a report on what is happening in the deep woods." He waited for a reaction, his jaw set, his breathing slow. He watched the superintendent's fingers hover over the edge of the desk, sensing the man's internal calculation. Thomas knew the terrain. He knew how to track a predator, and he knew how to read the silence of a man hiding a lie. He held his ground, refusing to let the moment pass without the truth being laid bare. "Look at it," Thomas commanded, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous register. "Just look at the evidence." The superintendent finally moved, but not to open the folder. With a sharp, practiced flick of his wrist, he shoved the manila document toward the edge of the desk. It skidded across the smooth wood, stopping inches from the floor before falling off the side. The paper hit the carpeted ground with a dull thud. The superintendent sighed, a sound of profound boredom, and picked up a pen as if to return to his work. He did not look at Thomas. He did not ask for clarification. He simply tapped his fingers against the desk, a steady, rhythmic noise that signaled the end of the conversation. The silence that filled the room felt heavy, suffocating, and absolute. It was the sound of a wall going up, a calculated refusal to acknowledge the reality Thomas had brought into the room. Thomas stood motionless. He watched the folder lying on the floor, the truth contained within its pages treated like discarded waste. The superintendent leaned back in his chair, his eyes fixed on the window behind Thomas, pointedly ignoring his presence. The message was clear. The evidence did not matter because the decision had already been made. There would be no discussion. There would be no investigation. The office had become a tomb for the truth, and Thomas was being told, without a single word being spoken, that his 30 years of service were worth nothing compared to the silence they required. Thomas did not move to pick up the fallen file. He remained standing, his gaze fixed on the superintendent, who was now intently studying a blank spot on the wall. The air in the office felt thin, charged with the static of 30 years of loyalty turning into sharp, cold resentment. Thomas watched the rhythmic movement of the man's throat as he swallowed, a small, involuntary twitch that betrayed the composure he was trying to project. The silence stretched, filled only by the mechanical ticking of a clock on the wall and the muffled sound of traffic outside. Every second that passed stripped away the last remnants of the respect Thomas had held for the man behind the desk. He saw the way the superintendent avoided the floor, avoided the folder, and avoided the truth. There was no argument left to make. The bureaucratic machinery had hardened into a shield, and Thomas realized that the man he had once mentored had become the very obstacle he now had to dismantle. He tightened his grip on his own knuckles until the bones ached. He did not say another word. He turned, his movements stiff and precise, and walked toward the exit. He reached the door, placed his hand on the cold metal handle, and paused. The decision was made. The hierarchy was broken. The heavy office door clicked shut behind him, but the sound did not echo in the hallway. Instead, it dissolved into the sharp, clear ring of a distant bird song. The stale air of the building vanished, replaced by the scent of damp earth and pine needles. The lighting shifted from artificial fluorescent hum to the golden, unfiltered glow of a sunrise filtered through thick canopy. 30 years ago, the park entrance looked different then. The gate was freshly painted, the wood grain still tight and vibrant. Thomas stood at the threshold, his boots clean and his stride light. He held a rolled map in his hand, the paper stiff and smelling of ink and possibility. He looked at the vast green expanse stretching toward the horizon, a world that felt infinite and waiting to be understood. He took a single step forward, his shadow stretching long across the gravel path. There was no weight of bureaucracy here, no files to be ignored, no walls to block the truth. Just the map, the forest, and a promise he had made to himself to learn every inch of the land. He adjusted the strap on his shoulder and began to walk. The path ahead was empty, silent, and entirely his to protect. The map was more than paper to him. It was a living record of the ground beneath his feet. Thomas spent those first weeks walking until his soles thinned. He traced every contour line with his thumb, matching the ink to the reality of the ridge. He climbed the highest overlooks, squinting through the morning haze to identify the exact point where the granite crumbled into shale. He found a stream that did not appear on the official survey, a hidden vein of water cutting through the valley floor. He knelt in the mud, pulled out his graphite pencil, and sketched the deviation with precise, jagged lines. He felt the rise of the earth in his calves and the cooling air as he descended into the ravines. He memorized the way the sunlight hit the southern slope at noon and how the shadows stretched across the basin by dusk. He did not just walk the park, he cataloged it. By the end of the month, he could navigate the thickest brush with his eyes closed, his mind holding a perfect, three-dimensional model of every stream and slope. The land became a language he was teaching himself to speak fluently. Knowledge of the land meant nothing if it died with him. Thomas began bringing new recruits into the deep woods, away from the paved loops and marked trails. He would stop abruptly, holding up a hand to signal total silence. He pointed to the north side of a downed hemlock, where the moss grew in a thick, velvet carpet. "Look at the density," he told them. "It tells you exactly where the moisture holds and where the wind shears." He crouched, pressing his palm against the bark to feel the subtle temperature shift. He taught them to track the wind by watching the movement of the high canopy, not the low brush. When a recruit would miss a subtle change in the elevation, Thomas would make them turn back. He walked them through the same mile 5 times, until they could distinguish the sound of a dry creek bed from the rustle of shifting leaves. It was not just showing them the park. He was rewriting their instincts. He turned the raw, chaotic forest into a readable sequence of signs. By the time they reached the clearing, the recruits stood straighter, watching the horizon with sharpened focus. He was the anchor, the one who ensured they understood that the forest did not yield its secrets to those who rushed. Survival was the final curriculum. Thomas led them into the high ridges during the transition of seasons, where the temperature plummeted after sundown. He took their packs, he took their compasses. He left them with nothing but the clothes on their backs and the requirement to find shelter before the frost settled. He watched from the tree line as they scrambled, their movements frantic at first, then deliberate. One recruit struggled to find dry tinder, his hands shaking in the cold. Thomas stepped out, gripped the boy's wrist, and forced him to slow his breathing. The forest provides, but only if you stop fighting the clock. By the 3rd hour, the recruit had a fire burning, his eyes fixed on the flames with a cold, calculating intensity. They learned to read the sky for incoming storms and to navigate by the stars when the ground became a blur of shadows. These lessons were meant to keep them alive in the wild, but the recruits took that same survival instinct and turned it inward. They began to see the park office as another terrain to master, a structure to be climbed. Thomas watched them sharpen their focus, unaware that the same drive he instilled to protect the trees was now being redirected toward their own ascent. The shift happened slowly, then all at once. Thomas stayed in the deep woods, marking trees and clearing trails, but the faces in the district office began to change. His former students moved into high-backed chairs, trading their field boots for polished leather. He watched from the periphery as they stopped coming to the ridges. They spent their days in meetings, their attention fixed on budget spreadsheets and park expansion targets. Thomas noticed the change in their priorities when he called the front office to report a failing bridge in the northern sector. He stood by the landline in the small cabin, listening to the static. "I need a crew out there by Monday," he said into the receiver. The voice on the other end was one he had taught to start a fire in a downpour. Now, the tone was clipped, hurried, and distant. "Thomas, we are focusing on visitor capacity this quarter. The bridge will have to wait." The line clicked dead. He hung up and looked at his hands, calloused and mapped with dirt. He tried again a week later, then a month. Each attempt met the same silence, or a polite redirection to a junior secretary who did not know his name. The forest remained, but the men he had trained to protect it were no longer looking at the trees. Thomas walked into the district office, the floorboards groaning under the weight of his boots. The air inside was recycled and stale, heavy with the sharp scent of toner and expensive roasted coffee. He moved toward the main corridor, his gait steady, the rhythm of a man who had spent 30 years on uneven soil. A group of younger staff members hurried past, their voices a blur of project timelines and quarterly projections. One of them, a man Thomas had once pulled from a frozen ravine, brushed past him. There was no nod, no pause, no flicker of recognition. Thomas stopped in the center of the hallway, his presence a static ripple in their momentum. He watched them vanish into the break room, the door swinging shut with a metallic click. He looked at the walls, lined with framed photographs of landscapes he had mapped by hand, now obscured by posters for park tourism events. He approached the front desk, his fingers brushing the cool laminate. The receptionist did not look up from the screen, her keyboard clacking in a rapid, indifferent staccato. He stood there for a full minute, watching the clock on the wall tick away the seconds. He was a fixture of the foundation, yet here, he was invisible. He turned, the heavy silence of the office pressing against his back, and walked out into the unfiltered light of the afternoon. The new guard operated differently. They spent their shifts behind the wheels of idling trucks, patrolling the paved arteries that cut through the park. Thomas watched them from the edge of the trailhead as a patrol vehicle rolled past, the engine humming a low, constant note. The ranger inside was focused on a tablet, the screen's blue light washing over his face, completely detached from the canopy shifting above. They stayed on the asphalt. They stayed where the cell reception held. Meanwhile, the remote sectors Thomas had maintained for 3 decades were beginning to reclaim themselves. Vines choked the signage. Fallen timber blocked the paths he had cleared by hand. He saw a branch snap under the weight of a heavy pile of deadwood on the main trail, a hazard that would take 10 minutes to clear. The patrol truck slowed, the driver glanced at it, and then simply accelerated away. He felt the grit of the road beneath his boots, a stark contrast to the soft, unkempt soil of the deep woods. It was clear that the mission had shifted from protection to convenience. Thomas tightened the straps of his pack. If the roads were the only thing they cared to monitor, he would have to become the eyes for the places they were choosing to forget. The sun dipped below the horizon, pulling the warmth from the air and leaving behind a damp, chilling mist. Thomas moved past the final trail marker, where the gravel ended and the true wilderness began. He did not use a flashlight. He knew the root systems by heart. He knew which stones were loose and which branches dipped low to catch an unwary traveler. The forest at night was a different entity entirely. It breathed with a low, rhythmic vibration that felt heavy against his chest. He moved with a practiced, silent gait, his boots finding purchase on moss-covered earth without a sound. Then, the night birds went quiet. A sudden, unnatural stillness descended upon the canopy. The kind of silence that usually preceded a predator. Thomas crouched low, his back pressing against the rough, cold surface of a cedar. He listened. The wind carried a scent that did not belong here, stale diesel and the sharp, metallic tang of machinery. He waited, motionless, his pulse steady, his eyes adjusting to the absolute dark. The shift in the woods was complete. He was no longer just a walker, he was a ghost in the machine, tracking an intrusion that the daylight patrols were blind to see. The diesel scent grew sharper, cutting through the damp rot of the forest floor. Thomas pushed through a wall of manzanita, the branches clawing at his pack, and stepped into a space that had been silent for centuries. He stopped mid-stride, where a towering giant should have blocked the starlight. There was only empty air. He walked forward, his boots crunching on sawdust that felt like coarse sand beneath his soles. He reached the center of the clearing and placed his hand on the wood. It was cool, damp, and impossibly wide. The surface was jagged, marked by the violent teeth of a heavy-duty saw. He traced the rings with his fingertips, feeling the history of the tree, hundreds of years of growth erased in a single night. A profound stillness hung over the gap, a hollow space where the forest heartbeat had been severed. He looked up, seeing the jagged outline of the remaining canopy against the moon, a ragged edge of what used to be a seamless ceiling. He pulled a notebook from his pocket, his hand steady even as his jaw tightened. He began to record the dimensions, the location, and the date. This was not a fallen tree. This was a crime scene. Thomas stepped away from the stump and circled the perimeter of the clearing. His boots sank into the earth, which had been churned into a thick, black slurry. He knelt, his knees pressing into the cold mud, and traced the deep, jagged indentations left by heavy machinery. These were not the tracks of a park vehicle. The tread pattern was aggressive, designed for hauling massive loads over rough terrain. He reached into his pack and pulled out his camera. He checked the battery, the weight of the device familiar and solid in his grip. He crawled along the line of the ruts, moving toward the edge of the dense brush where the forest had been forced open. He raised the camera, aligned the lens with the deepest impression in the mud, and pressed the shutter. The flash ignited, a sharp, brilliant white pulse that tore through the darkness for a split second. The light revealed a path of destruction extending deep into the restricted zone, a corridor of flattened saplings and crushed ferns. He fired again, capturing the depth of the ruts and the unnatural width of the path. He did not rush. He worked with methodical, clinical precision, ensuring every image documented the violation clearly. He was building a case, one flash at a time, within the heart of the dying woods. He moved back to a high ridge overlooking the main logging access point, a narrow gap between two ancient pines. He settled into the pine needles, his body rigid as he adjusted his position to minimize his silhouette against the moonlight. The silence of the forest was soon broken by the low, guttural rumble of a heavy engine. Thomas pressed his back against the bark, holding his breath as the first truck rolled into view. It moved slowly, its headlights doused, guided only by the pale lunar glow. He waited until the vehicle reached the clearest patch of ground. He raised his binoculars, steadying his elbows on his knees, and focused on the rear plate. He pulled his notebook out, the paper crisp and dry. With a pen gripped tightly, he scribbled the alphanumeric code. A second truck followed, then a third. Each time, he recorded the time, the plate, and the direction of travel. His fingers grew numb in the night air, but he did not pause. He tracked every movement, his gaze shifting between the shadows and the page. He was a ghost in his own woods, watching the theft unfold, building a ledger of evidence that would eventually pull the entire operation into the light. Thomas retreated to a hollow beneath a fallen cedar, where the earth was dry and the canopy thick enough to block the wind. He pulled a topographical map from his inner pocket, unfolding it with practiced, deliberate movements. He smoothed the creases against his thigh, the paper crinkling in the quiet. By the dim glow of a hooded penlight, he began to reconcile the license plate sightings with the geography of the park. He drew thin, dark lines across the map, tracing the illegal routes that sliced through the protected ridges. His pen moved with rhythmic precision, scratching against the textured paper. Each notation was small, concise, and damning. He recorded the specific timber density of the zones being targeted, cross-referencing the estimated haul weight with the number of trucks he had logged. The forest floor groaned under the weight of the night, but Thomas did not look up. He focused entirely on the notebook, filling pages with data that no one else had bothered to track. His hand ached, but the rhythm of the work remained constant. He added a final note, circled a cluster of coordinates, and snapped the notebook shut. The sound echoed briefly in the hollow, a sharp click that broke the stillness. He tucked the ledger into his pack, his eyes scanning the darkness, ready for the next move. The woods grew dense, the brush thick with thorns that snagged his pack. Thomas moved with the silence of a predator, stepping only on stones and bare earth. He crested a small rise and froze. Below him, the air changed, heavy with the sharp, chemical stench of diesel and saw oil. He dropped into a crouch behind the massive, gnarled trunk of an ancient cedar. Two men emerged from the gloom, their boots crunching loudly on the duff. They stopped 10 feet from his position. Thomas pressed his chest flat against the rough, cold bark, his breath shallow, controlled. One of the men leaned against the very tree that hid him, the wood vibrating with the man's weight. Thomas tightened his grip on his notebook, his knuckles white. He could hear the low murmur of their voices, the words indistinct, but the tone harsh and hurried. A twig snapped under a boot, a sound like a gunshot in the still night. Thomas did not flinch, his eyes locked on the space between the roots. He was a shadow among shadows, a witness to the violation of the land. When they finally moved on, the silence that followed felt fragile. He waited until their heavy footfalls faded into the distance, then pushed himself up, his pulse drumming against his ribs, knowing now exactly how close the danger had become. Thomas crawled toward the clearing where the canopy had been torn open. A massive redwood lay silent on the forest floor, its trunk severed near the base. He climbed onto the stump, the wood still weeping fresh amber sap that clung to his fingers. He pulled a small magnifying glass from his pocket and pressed it against the raw surface. He began to count. 1 year, 10 years, a century. Each ring was a testament to time, a dense record of droughts, fires, and seasons that had passed before the nation even existed. He traced the lines with his thumbnail, feeling the sheer volume of history that had been erased in a single night of work. The scale of the loss was staggering. It was not just timber. It was a living archive, now reduced to a jagged, splintered platform. He stopped at a dark, dense ring that marked a major drought 300 years ago. He leaned in, his breath hitching, realizing the depth of the void left in the forest. He pulled out his notebook and began to sketch the diameter of the stump, his pen marking the exact count of the rings. He worked with a cold, focused intensity, documenting every inch of the destruction. As he finished the entry, he looked up at the empty space where the crown of the tree used to reach for the stars. The silence here was heavy, filled with the weight of what could never be replaced. Thomas moved to the edge of the service road, his pen moving across the map in frantic, precise strokes. He marked the points of origin, then traced the tire tracks he had logged over the last month. The lines intersected at the main gate, then branched out toward the North District. He pulled his notebook out, comparing the timestamps of the heavy machinery movements with the official patrol logs he had memorized years ago. The pattern emerged with terrifying clarity. The loggers were not sneaking in. They were operating during the exact windows when the main patrols were ordered to stay on the perimeter. He highlighted 3 separate routes that had been cleared of debris just hours before the trucks arrived. This was not a rogue operation. It was a coordinated, systemic dismantling of the park's protected core. He sat on a mossy rock, his fingers tracing the routes on the paper. The logistics were too complex, the coordination too tight for this to be a small-scale theft. Someone with access to the master's schedules was clearing the way. He looked toward the district headquarters in the distance, the truth settling into his chest like lead. The people who were supposed to be the guardians of the forest were the ones holding the gate open. He closed his notebook, the weight of the conspiracy now fully realized, and turned his back on the road. The door to the cabin clicked shut, sealing out the damp night air. Thomas did not turn on the overhead light. Instead, he struck a match, the small flame casting long, flickering shadows across the walls. He walked to the corner of the room where a series of maps and photographs were pinned to the wooden boards. He began to organize the findings, moving the pictures of the tire tracks into a circle around the main district office on the map. He pinned his notebook pages to the center, creating a web of connections that spanned the entire North Range. The evidence stared back at him, an undeniable proof of the rot that had taken hold. He stepped back, the floorboards creaking under his weight. He could see the full picture now. Every route, every timestamp, every cleared path led back to the same source. He looked at his hands, calloused and steady, and realized there were no more people to report this to. The system was the perpetrator. He reached for a glass of water, his movements mechanical and deliberate. The silence of the cabin was absolute, but it no longer felt empty. It felt like a decision. He took one last look at the wall, blew out the lamp, and sat in the dark. He knew exactly what had to be done. Integrity is not a roar. It is not found in grand gestures or public applause. It is the steady, quiet work that happens long after the sun has set and the observers have gone home. Thomas sat in the dark, the weight of the evidence wall pressing against the silence of the cabin. He knew the cost of what he was about to do. He knew the risk of standing against a system that rewarded silence. If you believe that quiet courage wins in the end, hit subscribe. We tell stories of people who did the right thing when no one was watching. The world often forgets the ones who labor in the margins, the ones who refuse to look away when the truth becomes inconvenient. It is easy to be loud when you are supported, but it takes something else entirely to be right when you are alone. By choosing to act, you are not just witnessing a story. You are recognizing the value of the unseen. We are building a record of those who held their ground in the face of indifference. Stay with us as we uncover the rest of this journey. The truth has a way of surfacing, and we are here to ensure it is heard. Every story we feature is a testament to the power of the overlooked. History is often written by the loudest voices, but it is shaped by those who work in the shadows, unacknowledged and underestimated. We curate these accounts to remind you that strength is not measured by status or volume, but by persistence. When you subscribe to Midnight Confessions, you are doing more than following a feed. You are joining a collective that values the mechanics of justice over the optics of success. We seek out the people who were told to step aside, the ones whose warnings were dismissed as inconveniences, and the ones who decided that one person with the truth is more powerful than 1,000 who choose comfort. These stories connect us to a deeper human necessity, the need to know that actions have weight and that the truth eventually finds its way to the surface. We remain here, watching the margins, waiting for the moments when the quiet ones finally speak. Our mission is to ensure those moments are never lost. You have chosen to pay attention, and that makes you part of the record. Let us continue into the heart of the matter, where the real work of Thomas Reed is about to demand everything he has left. The forest floor was a map of fresh scars. Thomas moved through the brush, his boots making no sound on the damp pine needles. He reached the final perimeter of the illegal cut, where the heavy machinery had gouged deep, jagged ruts into the earth. He pulled his notebook from a pocket and checked the time. Midnight. A pair of headlights swept across the canopy above, the engine rumble vibrating through his chest. He pressed himself into the shadow of a thick cedar, holding his breath until the truck passed. He waited for the silence to return before stepping out. He moved to the center of the clearing, his flashlight covered by a thin piece of red cloth to keep the beam focused and dim. He recorded every license plate on the parked logging trailers. He measured the diameter of the freshly felled timber with a steel tape. He took photos of the logs marked with unauthorized stamps. Every entry was precise. Every detail was a nail in the coffin of the operation. He checked his watch one last time, closed the notebook, and tucked it securely into his pack. The evidence was complete. He turned his back on the destruction and began the long hike out of the woods, the weight of the book in his pack feeling like a heavy, cold anchor. The engine turned over with a low, steady growl. Thomas shifted into gear and pulled away from the trailhead, the forest fading into the rearview mirror. 3 hours of highway lay ahead. He kept his eyes on the white lines, his grip on the steering wheel firm, knuckles white against the dark material. A sudden construction detour forced him onto a gravel shoulder, stalling his progress for 20 minutes. He sat in the idling vehicle, watching the clock tick, his jaw set in a rigid line. Every minute spent in the silence of the cabin sharpened his focus. He did not turn on the radio. He did not reach for the water bottle on the passenger seat. He simply watched the road. When the traffic finally cleared, he accelerated, the tires gripping the asphalt as he merged back into the lane. The district office loomed on the horizon, a gray block of concrete under the midday sun. He pulled into the parking lot, the gravel crunching beneath his tires. He killed the engine, the silence rushing back into the cabin. He reached into the seat beside him, his fingers closing around the manila folder. The time for observation had ended. He pushed the door open and stepped out onto the pavement, ready for what came next. The lobby air was dry, smelling of floor wax and stale coffee. Thomas took a seat on the plastic chair near the reception desk. He placed the heavy manila folder across his lap, his fingers resting firmly on the paper. A group of younger rangers walked through the main corridor, their voices echoing against the tile floors. They stopped by the water cooler, laughing, their movements loose and hurried. One of them glanced at Thomas, eyes flicking over him with a brief, dismissive smile before turning back to the group. They did not slow down. They did not offer a nod of recognition. To them, he was merely an object in the room, a relic of a different era taking up space. Thomas watched them, his expression unmoving. He did not shift his posture. He did not acknowledge the slight. He simply held the folder, feeling the weight of the evidence through the cardboard. Every minute that passed felt like a deliberate test of his resolve. The clock on the wall ticked with a hollow, mechanical rhythm. He adjusted his grip on the file, the edges pressing into his palms. He kept his gaze forward, waiting for the inner office door to open, his focus narrowing until there was nothing left in the world but the contents of the folder. The heavy door clicked open. A secretary gestured toward the inner office without speaking. Thomas rose, the folder tucked firmly under his arm. He walked across the lobby, the sound of his boots rhythmic and sharp against the linoleum. He reached the threshold and stopped. The superintendent stood by the window, back turned, looking out at the parking lot. The room felt smaller than it had years ago. The air was stagnant, heavy with the scent of old paper and ozone. The superintendent did not turn around as Thomas stepped inside. He remained still, hands clasped behind his back, his posture radiating a singular, icy intent. Thomas walked to the center of the room and waited. He could hear the low hum of the ventilation system, a steady drone that filled the silence between them. The superintendent finally shifted his weight, turning slowly to face the room. His eyes were hard, fixed on the manila folder before they even met Thomas's gaze. The door behind Thomas clicked shut, the sound echoing like a finality. The temperature in the room seemed to drop. Thomas did not wait for an invitation to speak. He stepped forward and placed the folder on the mahogany desk, the wood grain cold beneath his fingertips. He felt the weight of the evidence, the reality of the force trapped within those pages, now laid bare in the heart of the administration. Thomas flipped the metal fasteners on the manila folder. He slid a stack of photographs across the dark wood surface. The first image showed the jagged, raw edge of a redwood stump, its rings exposed and weeping sap. He placed the second photo down, showing deep, fresh tire treads pressed into the soft earth of a protected trail. Thomas did not speak. He let the images occupy the space between them. The superintendent leaned down, his shadow falling across the prints. He shifted them with one finger, his movements slow and deliberate. He looked at the license plate numbers logged in the margins of the notes, then back at the photographs. The initial curl of his lip, meant to signal annoyance, vanished. His jaw set. His breathing slowed until it was barely audible. He looked up, his eyes locking onto Thomas with a sudden, unnerving clarity. He did not blink. He did not reach for his pen or phone. He simply stood there, his stillness more aggressive than any shout. The office lights hummed, the sound sharp and grating in the sudden absence of movement. The superintendent braced his hands on the desk, his knuckles turning white, and the air in the room grew tight, charged with the weight of what had just been exposed. The superintendent pushed the photographs back across the desk with a single sharp motion of his palm. He did not look at the images again. He stood upright, his movements rhythmic and controlled. He took a slow breath, the sound whistling slightly through his teeth. "Thomas," he said, his voice dropping to a low, steady pitch that seemed to vibrate against the walls. "You have spent too long in the woods. You are seeing patterns in the wind where there is only natural decay. This is a misunderstanding. Nothing more." He leaned forward, his palms flat against the wood, creating a physical barrier. The room felt suddenly devoid of oxygen. He did not raise his voice, but the intensity of his focus was a blunt instrument. "We have a protocol for these things, and it does not involve loose ends or amateur investigations." He paused, letting the implication hang in the space between them. The hum of the office seemed to drop an octave, turning into a low, menacing drone. He tapped the folder with a rhythmic, steady beat of his index finger. "You are mistaken, Thomas. You need to walk away from this right now. Do not pursue this line of thought any further. It is for your own good." The superintendent stopped tapping the folder. His hand went still, pressing the paper flat against the desk. He stood up fully, his height dominating the small office, and extended his arm toward the heavy mahogany door. The wood grain looked dark and impenetrable in the dim light. "Drop it, Thomas," he said, his voice stripped of all pretense of professional courtesy. "It is a misunderstanding. Forget you saw anything, or hand in your badge today." The silence that followed was absolute. Thomas stood frozen, his eyes fixed on the door handle. The metal glinted, a cold reminder of the path out. The superintendent did not move. He remained anchored to his position of power, waiting for the surrender he felt entitled to. Every second that ticked by felt like a physical weight against Thomas's chest. He looked at the folder, then at the man behind the desk, and finally at the door. The choice was clear: the comfort of his remaining years or the integrity of the forest he had spent 3 decades protecting. His muscles tightened, his jaw locked, and the air in the room seemed to vibrate with the tension of an impending break. He was no longer a subordinate. He was a man standing on the edge of a precipice, deciding whether to step back into safety or fall into the unknown. Thomas looked down at his chest. The badge caught the fluorescent light, its surface scratched from 3 decades of brush and rain. He reached up, his fingers tracing the cold, raised metal. It felt heavier than it had that first morning 30 years ago. He remembered the smell of pine needles in the morning mist, the way the light filtered through the canopy, and the thousands of miles he had tracked across the ridgelines. That metal emblem had once been a promise of protection. Now, it felt like a hollow shell. He unpinned it, the metal biting into his thumb as he pulled the clasp free. He set it on the desk. It landed with a dull, final thud against the mahogany. The sound was small, but it rang through the office like a gavel. He watched the badge slide an inch across the polished surface. The forest was being stripped. The giants were falling. And this piece of metal had become a weight he could no longer carry. If the land died, the rank meant nothing. He stood straight, his hands falling to his sides, his grip no longer trembling. The decision was made. He did not look back at the superintendent, nor did he look at the folder. He turned his focus toward the threshold. Thomas pushed the heavy door open. It swung wide, hitting the stop with a sharp click that drew eyes from the outer office. He walked past the desks where he had trained half the staff, his pace steady, his gaze fixed on the exit. Nobody spoke. The typing continued, a rhythmic, indifferent sound that underscored his sudden displacement. He reached the glass lobby doors, pushed through, and felt the sudden shift in air temperature. Outside, the park headquarters looked exactly as it had for 30 years, but the ground beneath his feet felt different. He walked past his parked vehicle, his hand brushing the door handle without grabbing it. He did not go home. He stopped at the edge of the asphalt and faced the horizon. The sun was dipping low, casting a long, jagged shadow toward the east. Far beyond the tree line, the city skyline shimmered in the haze, a cluster of steel and glass that held the authority he now needed to confront. He traced the silhouette of those towers against the darkening sky. The distance felt immense, a 3-hour stretch of road that separated his past from the necessity of what came next. He took a long, slow breath of the cooling air, turned away from the forest, and began the walk to his car. The engine turned over with a low vibration that traveled up the steering wheel. Thomas shifted into gear and pulled away, the gravel crunching beneath his tires for the final time. The tall pines that had been his life for 3 decades blurred into a wall of dark green as he picked up speed. As the miles accumulated, the road smoothed out. The narrow, winding trails of the preserve gave way to the wide, straight asphalt of the interstate. He watched the rearview mirror until the park entrance was nothing but a speck in the distance. The atmosphere inside the car stayed heavy. He kept both hands on the wheel, his knuckles tight, eyes locked on the road ahead. Slowly, the horizon began to change. The vibrant green of the canopy faded into the washed-out browns and grays of industrial expansion. Smokestacks appeared in the distance, piercing the sky, and the clean scent of pine was replaced by the metallic tang of urban air. He did not slow down. He passed the signs for the city limits, his foot steady on the pedal. The transition was complete. He was no longer a ranger in his woods. He was a man entering the belly of the machine, and he held the evidence to tear it down. The federal office building loomed, a slab of concrete and polished steel that dwarfed the surrounding traffic. Thomas stepped through the revolving glass doors, the air inside sterile and chilled. He walked toward the security desk, his boots heavy on the marble floor. The guard behind the console looked up, scanning him, then gestured toward the metal detector. Thomas stepped through, the machine silent as he passed, his movements deliberate and slow. He did not look at the other visitors waiting in the lobby. He kept his gaze on the directory board, finding the floor number and moved toward the elevators. The door slid open with a soft, mechanical hiss. He stepped inside, pressing the button for the upper level. As the elevator ascended, the city noise faded into a dull vibration. He stood in the center of the car, his posture rigid, his hands resting on his sides. The elevator chimed and the doors opened to a quiet, carpeted hallway. He stepped out, his eyes adjusting to the bright fluorescent lights. At the far end of the corridor, the glass doors marked with the federal seal stood waiting. He walked toward them, his steps echoing in the narrow space. He reached the handle, paused for a heartbeat, and pushed forward. The agent sat behind a desk, cluttered with folders and a glowing screen. He did not look up immediately. Thomas reached into his bag, pulled out the worn notebook, and dropped it onto the desk. The thud made the agent flinch. Thomas did not wait for an invitation. He pulled out a thick stack of photographs and spread them across the polished surface. They overlapped, a mosaic of mud, tire tracks, and clear-cut forest floor. The agent shifted his chair back, his eyes darting from the photos to Thomas. He reached out to touch a print, his finger tracing the depth of a tractor tread pressed into the wet earth. Thomas dumped the rest of the contents, loose receipts, hand-drawn maps of secret logging paths, and logs of license plates recorded under the moon. The pile grew, burying the agent's keyboard. The silence in the room stretched until it was sharp. The agent stopped typing. He leaned in, his face inches from the photographs, and finally looked up at Thomas. The skepticism in his eyes was replaced by a slow, dawning realization of the scale of the crime. Thomas stood perfectly still, his hands resting on the edge of the desk, waiting for the first question. The agent pulled a digital tablet toward him, but Thomas shook his head. He reached into his inner pocket and retrieved a final, folded map, yellowed at the edges. He smoothed it over the center of the desk, pinning the corners down with his thumbs. Thomas pointed to a series of red ink dots scattered across the terrain. "These are not just trees," he said, his voice steady. "These are the deep-cut extraction points. The illegal haul roads connect here, here, and here." He recited the GPS coordinates for every site, his voice rhythmic and precise, reciting latitude and longitude as if reading from a map he had memorized in his sleep. The agent tapped the numbers into his terminal, the keys clicking in rapid succession. As each coordinate locked, a map on the wall monitor flickered to life, showing a constellation of violations centered exactly where the superintendent had claimed nothing existed. Thomas traced a line with his finger, linking the furthest site to the main park road. The timber was moved under the cover of night, using abandoned access gates that only the administration had keys to. The agent stopped typing, looking at the screen where the web of data now clearly outlined the path of the theft. The evidence was no longer just paper. It was a map of a crime. The agent stood up and walked to the door, locking it behind him. He returned and opened a secure cabinet, pulling out a thick, black-bound ledger. He began documenting every coordinate Thomas had provided. He made 3 phone calls, his voice low and urgent, speaking into a headset that kept his hands free for the keyboard. On the wall monitor, the map expanded. New layers appeared: satellite imagery of the park, thermal scans of the forest, and surveillance logs of every vehicle entering the restricted zones. The agent typed a command and the screen flashed with a red code, "Task Force Authorized." He pressed a button, sending the data packets to a dozen waiting terminals in the hallway. Doors opened. Men and women in tactical gear began gathering around the central table, their faces set in grim lines as they reviewed the maps. The agent pointed to the screen, tracing the illegal logging paths with a laser pointer. He moved with a speed that signaled the end of the waiting period. They checked their equipment, snapped folders shut, and moved toward the exit. The federal wheels were turning, and the park was no longer a hidden site of theft, but a target for a coordinated, massive reclamation. The heavy trucks rolled into the park entrance at dawn, their tires churning the gravel of the main road. Dust billowed, coating the leaves of the lower canopy. At the primary access gate, a federal officer stepped out, hand resting on his sidearm, and signaled for the convoy to halt. Half a mile deep into the restricted zone, The sound of a chainsaw suddenly cut out, then another. The rhythmic roar of the logging machines, which had dominated the valley for months, sputtered and died. The silence that followed was absolute, heavy with the weight of the forest. Men working near the stumps looked toward the sound of approaching engines, dropping their tools as the tactical teams surged through the brush. At the main perimeter, the officer grabbed the heavy iron chain draped over the gate. He looped it through the thick steel links, pulled it taut, and snapped a heavy-duty padlock into place. The sound of the metal lock clicking shut echoed across the valley floor. The gates were sealed. No vehicles moved. No timber would leave the park. The extraction had been stopped in its tracks, and the forest, for the first time in months, held nothing but the sound of the wind. The command tent was the first to be breached. It stood amidst a sea of churned earth and splinters, a stark white landmark in the ruined clearing. Agents moved with surgical precision, forcing the logging executives away from their desks and maps. One man stood, his hands raised, his face pale as he looked at the tactical gear surrounding him. He tried to speak, but the agent ignored him, spinning him around and pinning his arms back. The metallic snap of steel handcuffs echoed sharply against the quiet trees. He stumbled, his polished leather shoes sinking deep into the dark, wet mud of the extraction site. Beside him, two more managers were pulled from the shadows of the tent. They looked down at their feet, watching as the thick, gray slurry coated their ankles, effectively staining the symbols of their authority. They were marched toward the line of federal vehicles waiting at the edge of the clearing. The agents moved them with firm, professional grips, ignoring the protests and the frantic questions. Each step forward took them further from the machinery and the logs they had laid claim to. They were loaded into the transport vans, the doors slamming shut on the forest they had systematically dismantled. The clearing grew quiet again, leaving only the deep, muddy tracks of the convoy and the heavy, lingering scent of damp pine. The district office remained untouched by the chaos in the woods. The air was cool, filtered, and smelled faintly of floor wax. The superintendent sat behind his desk, staring at a stack of reports, when the heavy oak door swung open without a knock. Two agents walked in, their presence filling the small space. They did not speak. One held out a document, his face unreadable. The superintendent pushed his chair back, the wheels scraping harshly against the hardwood floor. He stood up, his eyes darting around the room, scanning the corners and the shadows near the door. He was looking for Thomas. He expected to see the man who had brought this ruin upon him, waiting to witness the end. But the office was empty. There was only the desk, the vacant chair where Thomas used to sit, and the silent, pressing weight of his own miscalculations. The agents stepped forward, one on each side. They took his arms with a firm, practiced grip. He did not fight back. As they led him toward the exit, he glanced back one last time at the empty room. The silence was louder than any accusation. He was walked out of the building, through the lobby, and into the harsh light of the afternoon, leaving behind the authority he had wielded so carelessly. The hall was draped in heavy velvet and bathed in the soft, golden light of late afternoon. High-ranking officials stood in rows, their faces polished and expectant, waiting for the guest of honor to take his place on the stage. A silk-lined box sat on the velvet cushion, holding the Department of Interior's highest honor. The silence in the room was brittle, held together by the collective anticipation of the crowd. The presenter stepped to the podium, cleared his throat, and announced the name, Thomas Reed. The applause began, rippling through the rows like a wave, but it slowed as the seconds ticked by. The spotlight hit the front row, illuminating a single, vacant wooden chair. It was pushed slightly back from the table, as if its occupant had just walked away. A murmur started in the back of the hall, growing into a confused hum. The presenter looked to the wings, then back to the empty seat, his smile faltering. Thomas was not coming. He was not there to receive the praise, nor to shake the hands of those who had once ignored his warnings. The metal remained on the cushion, a cold metallic token of a system that had finally caught up to the truth, while the man who had forced that truth to light was already miles away, back on the trail, walking in the quiet of the woods. The heavy machinery had long since been hauled away, leaving behind deep, jagged gashes in the earth. For a time, those tracks held stagnant water and oil, a permanent reminder of the violence done to the floor of the forest. But seasons shifted. Rain washed the grit from the soil, and the relentless cycle of growth began to overwrite the damage. Small green shoots pushed through the compacted mud where tires had once pressed the ground to stone. Ferns unfurled in the shadow of the stumps, masking the sharp edges with soft, layered fronds. The hum of chainsaws, which had once defined the rhythm of the valley, was replaced by the rustle of wind through high, untouched branches. Birds returned to the canopy, their calls echoing in spaces that had been hollowed out by industry. The air felt lighter, stripped of the scent of gasoline and sawdust. It was a slow, quiet reclamation. By the time the first snow dusted the ridge, the tire tracks were nothing more than shallow, grass-covered dips in the landscape. The forest had not forgiven the intrusion, but it had absorbed the wound, sealing it over with the slow, steady persistence of life. The silence was no longer heavy or defensive. It was simply the sound of a forest breathing again, anchored in the stillness of a world left to heal. The sun dipped low, casting long, bruised shadows across the forest floor. Thomas moved through the underbrush with the practiced ease of a man who knew the heartbeat of these woods. He reached the center of the old-growth grove, where the air grew cold and the ancient trees stood like pillars of a cathedral. He stopped before the largest redwood, a titan of bark and age that had survived centuries of storms. He leaned his palm against the rough, fissured surface, feeling the subtle vibration of the wind in the needles far above. For a moment, he did not move. He was a shadow against a shadow, his outline blending into the massive trunk until it was impossible to tell where the man ended and the tree began. He looked out over the expanse of the valley, watching the light fade from the ridges. There was no bitterness left, no need for recognition or ceremony. The work was done. The land was breathing. He stood there as a silent sentinel, a part of the landscape he had fought to save. His breathing slowed to match the sway of the branches. In the deepening twilight, he was simply a ghost of the woods, a man who had found his place in the resilience of the earth, finally at rest with the quiet weight of a life well lived. The sky turned from charcoal to a thin, bruised purple before the first light touched the ridge. Thomas opened his eyes. He did not need a clock. His body remembered the rhythm of 30 years spent chasing the dawn. He sat up, the floorboards cold beneath his feet, and moved to the kitchen window. The world outside was still waking up, a blurred landscape of gray and dark green. He went through the motions of his morning with the precision of a master craftsman. A splash of water on his face, the steady strike of a match to heat the kettle, the ritual of tightening his laces. Every movement was efficient, stripped of wasted energy. He checked the window again, watching the light sharpen the edges of the distant peaks. The house was quiet, but his mind was already in the field, tracking the changes in the wind and the shift in the soil. He pulled his gear from the hook by the door, the familiar weight settling against his shoulders. He was not a ranger by title anymore, yet he held the same responsibility. He stepped onto the porch as the sun breached the horizon, the golden light catching the dust motes in the air. He did not look back. There was ground to cover, and he had promised himself he would never stop watching. The porch door clicked shut behind him, sealing away the silence of the cabin. Thomas stood for a moment on the gravel, shifting his shoulders to seat the pack. The weight was substantial, a collection of compasses, notebooks, and field gear that pulled at his frame, but he leaned into it. The strap dug into his shoulder, a familiar pressure that anchored him to the present. He took the first step, his boots crunching against the frost-covered dirt. The rhythm of his gait was slow and measured, calibrated to the steepness of the incline. He navigated the switchbacks with a steady cadence, his eyes scanning the ground for signs of erosion or wildlife shifts. Every adjustment of his weight, a slight lean forward, a shift in his center of gravity was an unconscious reaction to the terrain. The pack did not drag him down. It held him to the path. He moved past the boundary markers of the park, his stride lengthening as he hit the familiar deep woods trail. The forest canopy closed overhead, filtering the early light into thin, golden needles of sun. He breathed in the scent of pine and damp earth, the physical exertion warming his muscles. He was exactly where he belonged, carrying the weight of his experience into the heart of the woods, one steady step at a time. The trail narrowed sharply where the creek bed widened. Thomas rounded a thicket of hemlock and came to a sudden halt. A few yards ahead, a young ranger stood in the middle of the path, staring at a digital map with a look of genuine confusion. The recruit held the device at arm's length, rotating it in circles while repeatedly checking the surrounding tree line. He looked lost, his focus entirely on the screen rather than the terrain. Thomas observed the scene for several seconds. The recruit's stance was stiff, his movements jagged and unsure. It was a mirror of his own first morning 30 years ago, when the map had been paper and the fear of getting lost had been a constant hum in his chest. Thomas stayed in the shadows of the hemlock, his boots silent on the damp earth. The recruit wiped sweat from his forehead and took a tentative step into a patch of loose shale, nearly losing his footing. Thomas exhaled, his lungs expanding against the weight of his pack. He stepped out from the cover of the trees, his presence suddenly filling the narrow space. The recruit jumped, nearly dropping the map, and turned toward the sound of Thomas's heavy, rhythmic boots on the trail. They stood only feet apart, the old man and the new, with 30 years of silence between them. The recruit stood frozen, his pulse visible in the rapid rise and fall of his chest. Thomas took 3 slow, deliberate steps forward, closing the gap until he could see the grit caught in the folds of the man's palms. He reached out and tapped the digital map in the recruit's hand, forcing the screen down toward the soil. The young man's eyes darted upward, locking into the steady, unblinking gaze of the elder. Thomas did not speak for a long moment, letting the sound of the wind through the canopy fill the gap between them. He looked past the man, then back into his eyes, his voice low and firm. "Walk quietly, watch carefully, and never stop taking notes." He punctuated each phrase with a sharp, rhythmic nod. The recruit shifted, his weight moving from his heels to the balls of his feet, his grip on the device loosening as the weight of the instruction took hold. Thomas did not wait for a response. He adjusted his pack, the leather straps creaking in the stillness, and stepped past the recruit. He continued along the trail, his boots finding the exact center of the path, leaving the young ranger standing alone amidst the trees, staring at the empty space where the veteran had just been. The trail stretched out before Thomas, a vein of packed dirt winding through the ancient timber. He did not look back. He knew the weight of the moment he left behind. Most people chase the glare of the spotlight, believing that noise and public acclaim are the only measures of significance. They want the applause, the title, and the visible confirmation of their worth. But the forest teaches a different lesson. The strength of these redwoods lies in the root systems hidden deep beneath the surface, interlocking and holding the earth together long after the storms have passed. Real power is never found in the center of the stage. It is found in the steady, rhythmic repetition of the work when no one is watching. It is in the ink, drawing on a notebook page, the correction of an error before it grows into a disaster, and the quiet persistence of doing what is right simply because it is necessary. Thomas kept his pace measured, his eyes scanning the horizon. He walked with the weight of decades behind him, knowing that the most enduring legacies are built in silence, not in the empty echo of fame. The spotlight fades, but the work remains, carved into the landscape by those who refuse to be distracted. If this story sparked a recognition of your own silent battles, you are in the right place. We exist to chronicle the lives of those who are underestimated, overlooked, or dismissed by the structures around them. The people who do not demand attention, yet are the ones who steer the course of history when the lights go out. You might feel like you are working in the dark, or that your efforts go unnoticed by those in power. Take heart. The most significant changes are often initiated by those who simply refuse to quit, even when the odds are stacked against them. They come back stronger, more focused, and ultimately, more effective than those who rely on noise to validate their existence. If you believe that quiet courage is the most potent force in the world, hit the subscribe button. Join us here at Midnight Confessions. We are building a community for the ones who watch, the ones who notice, and the ones who act. We tell these stories because they deserve to be heard, and because we never forget the people who did the right thing when the world was looking the other way. Look upward. Above the trails, above the human history of mistakes and corrections, the redwood canopy forms an endless, shifting ceiling. The light filters through the needles in thin, golden needles of clarity. It is here that the true scale of the world reveals itself. The wind moves through the high branches, a low vibration that echoes the patience of the forest itself. These trees have seen centuries of quiet decisions and unseen actions. They do not judge, but they remain, The perspective shifts, pulling back from the ground to reveal the vast, interconnected reach of the timber. In this silence, the distinction between the observer and the observed begins to blur. The quiet ones are always watching, woven into the very structure of the landscape. They are the constant in a world of temporary noise. They do not need the spotlight because they are the ones who hold the earth in place while the rest of the world rushes by. Every flicker of shadow against the bark is a testament to their presence. They are the eyes of the forest, steady and unblinking, marking the passage of time and the weight of every choice made in the dark. The canopy remains, a living record of those who persisted when no one else would. The light dims, pulling the color from the bark and leaves until only the deep, saturated green remains. This is the color of the forest floor, where the soil holds the history of everything that has fallen and everything that has risen. Justice, like the roots of these giants, operates beneath the surface. It is slow, it is heavy, it is constant. When the noise of the world finally recedes, this is what stays behind. The green deepens, swallowing the last traces of human intervention. No more footprints, no more trails, just the vast, breathing expanse of the wild. It is a reminder that the truth does not need a voice to exist, nor a spotlight to be valid. It simply is. As the image dissolves, the stillness feels absolute. A quiet pressure remains, a sense that the woods are keeping their own record of every act of integrity. The lens closes, leaving only the shadow of the trees and the weight of the silence. Whatever was lost, whatever was fought for, it returns to the earth now. The cycle resets. The forest waits, watchful. You are not alone in your persistence. Like this video, subscribe, and stay tuned. The work continues, and we will be here to document every step of the journey.